Very good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for very kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Radai, for your introductory remarks, and my friend Professor Nikulin and Alex, who have been very kind in inviting me here all the way from India. And it's really nice to be here in Moscow at this time of the year when it's slightly warmer and one could actually feel more like an India-like weather, the way we have in winters. So it's really a very pleasant visit in all sense. So thank you very much to all of you for making it possible. We are really delighted to be with all of you. And thank you also for organizing this book discussion, because as few minutes ago in the interview, the question was asked that India and Russia, they are two different time zones, not only in terms of time in the clock, but also time in the sense of the pace of development, the cultural differences, and all other kinds of historical developments the two countries have seen so far. So what brings me here to talk about this book, and what brings these two countries together when we are talking about it? So I'm really happy to discuss this book here because there are certain links which connects Russia closely with India, other than the historical past which we keep referring to, we keep talking to. Before I start talking about the argument of the book or the structure of the book, I would like to discuss briefly about the journey, how it started, what actually brought this issue to me, in fact, and I got so much interested and started working on it. So before I start, would you translate simultaneously, or it's okay I continue with it?
No, it's okay for the guys.
Okay.
We'll do it in English.
Okay, thank you. So when I started teaching in Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar University, which you mentioned, Professor, I was trying to do some research which is more connected to people, which I could feel more meaningful in a sense. And that was the time when the issue of farmer suicide was really becoming very crucial in India. And I thought that it would be best for a political scientist to do something which relates to people. Now, suicide as an issue is usually considered as something which concerns psychologists, or in case of development, which concerns economists. And I was by training a political scientist, especially studying international relations. When I did my PhD on Russian state and governance, it was a study of the Russian state and also trying to look at the way Indian state was changing. But then the question was how to relate the studies with the people in political science, moving beyond the structure of the government, election studies, and so on, and trying to find a linkage. That's where I found this issue really fascinating, and I started engaging with this issue. And other thing which made me interested in this was having a comparative politics as a frame. And it was in this context that I chose 3 different sides within India to understand this whole issue. Now, when I was trying to develop the whole issue in the form of an argument, I had 2 kinds of scholarship which I was engaging. One, economists who were largely raising the issue of farmer suicides from the perspective of economic development, especially linking it up with the issue of indebtedness. So the farmers who were having higher amount of debt, and when they found it difficult to repay, they had no other option but to kill themselves. That was one school of thought which was very prominent. The other school of thought which was trying to understand this issue was largely sociologists, who were trying to argue that the way Indian society was changing, the way rural society was undergoing the process of modernization, farmers were finding it difficult to cope up with that change, and that was eventually leading to suicides. Now, the question which I raised as a political scientist was, where is politics in this entire process? Does it exist? And if it does, then in what form? And that's where I started engaging with this issue from the perspective of rural change. When I went to the field, one thing which the first encounter that I had was farmers' families responding that the rural was not the same. India's villages were not the same what they used to be many decades ago. Now, what was that change which people were feeling? What were their thoughts about that change? And it was some kind of linkage with that process of change which led me to this entire idea of the book. Now, the title of the book called Dilapidation of the Rural. Now, when I was having discussion about the title of this book with my wife, Dr. Shalja Singh, who is also here with me, we were actually thinking of having a title which should capture this entire process in a more nuanced manner. So the traditional titles which we understand in political studies when we talk about a process of social change, political change, for example, the terms like transformation or transition, or the word called change, whether those words were enough to talk about it. So when we talk about transformation or transition, generally it is assumed that there is a predestined vision of change which exists, and one has to move from point A to point B, and it is that process which we are referring to when we are talking about change in terms of transition or transformation. What we thought to have something which refers to this process in a more emotional sense, and that's where the idea of dilapidation came in. So dilapidation as a word basically is used, and it was quite popularly used in 18th century Europe with reference to the changing countryside and the changing nature of buildings especially. So dilapidation is basically used many times about collapsing buildings, which are not collapsed, but they look old. They look like collapsing gradually. So it's a process of gradual collapse which has not really happened. And dilapidation of the rural tries to capture this phenomenon. Now, talking about suicides and linking it with politics brought in the second conceptual category, which is development and politics. How these two are linked and finally leading to what is referred here as suicides. So the idea of this book was to capture the politics behind development, its impact on rural and agrarian change, the kind of politics which was emerging in villages in rural India, and the way it is impacting the psychological behavior of the farmers. And one concept which figures in this book quite prominently when I'm talking about psychology is the phenomena of a sense of nostalgia which farmers have, a sense of attachment, a sense of emotional belonging to the idea of the rural. So what I will do is I will talk about the structure of the book, and I will discuss some of the arguments, and I'll try to read a couple of paragraphs from the book, and this is how I'll try to build the argument, what this book actually talks about. So there are seven major chapters in the book, apart from introduction and conclusion. The first two chapters are basically about describing the nature of rural change in India, and it tries to do that by focusing on two units. First is the notion of self, notion of an individual, and the second is about the changing nature of community. So these two chapters talk about what a farmer thinks of oneself, how a farmer or a farmer's family which had undergone a tragedy, they think of themselves. What constitutes their own meaning? How do they identify themselves in the entire social setup? The second chapter talks about what do they think about the nature of community in rural India. Now, when I'm talking about the notion of self, I'm also trying to explain that this idea of self in rural society, here I'm talking about India, is something which is closely related to the community in which one lives. And the meaning of individual here is not actually an independent meaning of individual. It's a meaning which one derives by looking at others. How others look at the individual, it is that which defines the notion of an individual. The second chapter is about the changing nature of community relations in India. Now here, I try to bring in a conceptual category which has by and large remained neglected in social sciences in general and political science in particular, which is the concept called public space. So when I'm talking about individual, the self, and its linking with community, what links these two? It's the public spaces, where the idea of an individual comes together with a society, with a community, and then defines oneself. The question is, what happens when these community spaces, public spaces, they undergo a change? The next three chapters are about the nature of politics, nature of development politics, and the kind of policy of rural development India has followed in the last 7 decades. The fourth chapter talks about the increasing intervention of party politics in rural spaces. So how gradually parties became very crucial actors in rural areas because of different reasons, and that actually redefined the nature of community relations in the rural society. Now, the process of democratization in India in the past 7 decades have been a remarkable process, and it has empowered many marginalized sections. It has helped many marginalized groups to gain meaning for themselves. But as we all know, when a society changes, it's not a one-side process. So there are few who try to develop, leaving their past behind and looking for a bright future. But there are others who associate themselves more with the past. And when this past changes, they find it difficult to cope up with that change. And this process becomes all the more difficult if there are economic hardships associated with it. So this chapter talks about those nuances of party politics in rural India, its impact on changing nature of the community and society, and what kind of psychological behavioral change it has produced. Now, the next chapter is something which I would say closely connects Russia and India. Now, the next chapter is about the policies, the policy change which India has witnessed. And within that policy change, I'm looking at it in different phases, five different phases. And what I'm trying to argue, that immediately after independence, India's first Prime Minister made efforts to have a balanced strategy of economic development of rural areas, but at the same time, social development of rural areas. So the idea of development was not really at the cost of rural development. Rural was very much part of the strategies of development. And within this, the biggest challenge which Indian policymakers had was the large number of small and medium farmers which India had at that time and which India continues to have. In such a situation, the agricultural development had to be imagined in such a way that it would take care of the needs of small farmers who had a small piece of land for their livelihood. And I must say that India continues to remain a country, apart from being the largest country in terms of population, whose majority population lives in villages, in rural areas, and its sizable population, half of the population, more than half of the population, is dependent upon agriculture for their livelihood. Though in India's GDP, the share of agriculture has gone down significantly in the last 3 decades, but a large number of people are still dependent upon agriculture. Now, these people who are dependent upon agriculture, a majority of them also live in rural areas. So the rural and agriculture in India, they are actually closely tied up. So what we call the word peasant in the traditional conceptual categories, that word peasantry continues to exist in India. And Professor Nikulin and we have been part of a collective where there are some colleagues, primarily Professor Henry Bernstein and others, who argue that peasantry is no more a reality. And I must say that last time when I was here, I feel that I was honored to have met Professor Theodore Shanin and had some discussions with him. I think peasantry as a category continues to remain relevant in India and in some parts of the world. Now, there are many who argue that peasantry is a different category which exists in Europe. I'm not getting into that debate, but group of farmers who are closely tied up with rural society and rural social setup, peasantry in that case very much exists in our part of the world. It's not an irrelevant category. Now, India's policymakers in 1950s did accept this reality. And the Gandhian idea of development was actually revolving around development of rural in a holistic sense. So in 1950s, when India starts developing its first policy, first 5-year plan, the focus was on collective farms, for which former Soviet Union supported India. by providing modern machinery, developing the concept, and so on. The second major policy intervention was development of cooperative sector. As we all know that Chinovian economics was revolving very much around development of family farms, development of cooperatives to provide support to these family farms, which was a reality of India at that time. So the idea of cooperative development, India started learning from China. And along with this, the Indian state also started supporting the local self-government institutions to make the people feel empowered. And the fourth biggest intervention which the Indian state made in 1950s was something called Community Development Program. Now, very few scholars discuss this. The idea of Community Development Program, India had learned with the help of United States. So, the policy of rural development in India was a mix of help, assistance, vision from USSR, China, and US. But the biggest support which came at that time was from USSR, and India continued to develop many of its collective farms with the help of USSR. Besides, the cooperative development was one major intervention which the Indian state made. Now, in 1960s, this policy changes and the focus shifts from a holistic rural development to the idea of agricultural development, where it was assumed that if agricultural development or development of agricultural economy takes place, it will gradually trickle down and it will eventually help the small and marginal farmers. Now, for this purpose, the entire idea of Green Revolution started. Green Revolution was a policy intervention whereby the Indian state started giving heavy subsidies, chemicals, fertilizers, high-yielding variety of seeds, technology, for example, tractors and so on, to give a big push to agricultural development. Now, this policy continues to remain dominant till the end of last century. It was only in the early 2000s that Government of India started focusing again on the idea of rural development. So what do I mean when I'm saying rural development? I mean providing better connectivity, providing health infrastructure, better education for children, eradication of poverty, child nutrition, and many other facilities. This debate started in India in late 1990s and early 2000s. So the policy phases which I'm talking, they make the distinction of different phases on the basis of it. Now, the next chapter talks about a major phenomena, which is the changing nature of rural community in a more economic sense. Now here I would like to just read a couple of paragraphs just to explain the meaning that I am talking. So when I'm saying that I'm talking about politics, what exactly that I'm referring to, and the chapter 6 actually heavily rests upon that definition. The political in this study refers to, in a Carl Schmittian sense, the process of making distinction between a friend or an enemy, or the, in quotes, degree of intensity of association and dissociation, unquote. Any significant change in the community relations in the village society changes the meaning of friendship and intensity of association of a peasant within his community. Usage of the term political being for a peasant does not merely indicate taking part in electoral activities or being a part of party politics as widely understood. Instead, and here there is a special focus in italics, instead, politics here refers to social activity and the process of destruction, creation, or recreation of spaces that promote or demolish the sense of inclusion and exclusion within a rural society. Emphasis ended. This process is not a mechanical, rule-bound process. Instead, it occurs in the state's everyday actions and interactions of the peasantry with the local bureaucracy, bank officials, agents, party members, or local office bearers of the parties. This process influences the nature of resources, welfare benefits from the government and their allocation, but it has profound psychological implications. Politics as a collective social activity has played a critical role in this process of rural socio-cultural change. Now, the process which I was defining so far, the biggest impact of it was the changing nature of meaning of friendship, association, and bonding. So the narratives which have been produced in the book, different family members said that we don't have the same friends which we used to have. The nature of that friendship has undergone a change for various reasons. But it's a two-way process. People have lost friends, but they have made new friends. The question which chapter 6 tries to highlight is, who are those new friends? And it says new allies, support price, financialization, and consumerism. So the farmers in contemporary society look at these phenomena as their new friends. And if you look at it closely, the requirement for all three new allies is their economy is at the center stage, not the society. So in international relations, what we say, the whole idea of interdependence has gradually vanishing. It is disappearing. Now, interdependence is going away, and it is paving way for economy being the central factor. The next chapter, which is the last major chapter, and I must say that this chapter was written before thousands of farmers in India occupied the national highways which was connecting the capital city with other parts of India. And this mass protest by the farmers continued for 1 year, and more than 30,000 farmers were sitting on different highways for a year. Irrespective of the weather change, irrespective of all political pressures, they stood there firm. The question is, why? Now, the immediate triggering point was the 3 farm laws which Government of India had adopted, saying that this will provide more choice to the farmers to sell their product. It will allow the private sector market to gradually take over the agricultural markets in India, which were otherwise controlled by the state. The government brought in these 3 laws saying that this will actually ensure economic benefits for the farmers. And even then, farmers protested heavily. And finally, in December 2021, the government was forced to withdraw these 3 farm laws. Now, the question which I try to highlight here, and later on in one more article I had tried to argue that it was actually not only about economic benefits, rather it was a kind of assertion by the farmers to reclaim, to regain the kind of community bonding which they felt existed in rural India. And they saw this as an opportunity to assert that identity. So if you look at the photographs which were clicked, published in the newspapers, farmers were trying to showcase their everyday farming life on the national highways of India. On everyday basis, they were trying to show the kind of community life which existed in rural India. Now, in this entire process, the question is that, is it all the glorification of the rural society, or is it something different? The effort in this book is to provide a view how the families responded to our questions related to a person who had killed oneself. But there are serious critical issues here which need further investigation. One is that this rural society which I have been talking, it's a masculinist rural society. So the continuous reference is it's the male farmer who feels left out. It's the male farmer who feels that his prestige, his ego is hurt because of various reasons. And when that male farmer feels that he is not able to protect the family as he is ought to, he has no other option but to kill oneself. Secondly, if we look at the rising inequalities in rural India, that is another major factor which is emerging. So who are the losers, who are the winners in this entire process is something which is a further critical question which needs further investigation. I would say that with the help of this book, I was not able to find many good answers perhaps. No book can claim that it gives all the answers. But I feel that one effort which makes me satisfied is that I was able to raise some critical questions which perhaps I need to further investigate, or maybe my other colleagues further need to investigate. And with countries like Russia, I especially look forward to look at the process of rural change in a comparative sense. What kind of impact it has on humans in rural areas, how their social fabric is changing, how it impacts their psychological behavior. These are the questions which further interest me. Now, one thing which is there is that the nature of development in these countries in terms of physical development is very different from the development in countries in South Asia. But is it possible to find some common factors, maybe some common psychological outcomes which we may find irrespective of differences in the nature or level of development? This is the question which I further look forward to explore, to understand. And I think it would be interesting to further have some kind of interdisciplinary dialogue by bringing in people from different disciplines together and develop our understanding. Now, the one question which many people asked when I was here in Ranepa 4 years back, 6 years back, sorry, and which was asked today as well, that the phenomena of farmer suicides, how grave it is, whether it is real. I would just like to read the report with which this book begins. And then I would end the today's talk. It says, according to a report published by the Down to Earth magazine, every day 25 farmers commit suicide in India. And this report was published almost 10 years ago. After that, this phenomena has further worsened. On December 11, 2018, The Guardian had reported the US farmer suicide crisis echoes a much larger crisis happening globally. An Australian farmer dies by suicide every 4 days. In UK, one farmer a week takes his or her own life. In France, one farmer dies by suicide by every 2 days. In India, more than 270,000 farmers have died by suicide since 1995. The point I'm trying to highlight, that the phenomena of farmer suicide is not something which is grave only in India. It is a grave phenomena which is happening in different parts of the world, including countries like Australia, which are known for very wealthy farming lobby and an economy which has a strong agriculture sector. France has a major problem of farmer suicide. So is in Italy and United States. I think there is a need to talk about the issue of farmer suicides, rural development, in a much serious sense than merely looking at it from the perspective of economic benefits of the farmers. I think such an interdisciplinary understanding of rural and agrarian would further help our understanding of our society and its change in a more scientific manner, in a more meaningful manner, and in a more humanistic manner. With that, I would like to thank you all again for your patient listening. Thank you for having me here, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for this very stimulating talk. And now, dear colleagues, it's time to the talks for our discussants. Alexandr Kurakin, you're welcome.
First of all, I would say that for me, this book is purely sociological. For political scientists, everything is political. For sociologists, everything is social, including economy and politics. I'm not going to directly discuss the content of the book because the author did it well and will always do it better than me. But rather, I would like to talk about some issues which the book raises. Not all of them, but out of my free choice. However, I still start with a brief repetition of the main logic or line or story of the book, at least as I understood it. Of course, oversimplifications are inevitable, but anyway. So long story short, men, and by men I mean not people, but males, in Indian villages find themselves between increasing demands from them, increasing inability to fulfill those demands, and the lack of options to ease off or mitigate that tension through social ties. As a result, that tension leads to suicides in many cases. As one of the respondents put it, they rely only on their own but cannot handle it. Seemingly quite a simple story. However, that story provokes further questions which are not that simple to answer. For instance, why those demands increased from men's? Why farmers rely exclusively on their own? Why society does not provide some help to cope with that tension? And the book seeks to answer those questions. And I would like to notice that those answers, which we can find in the book, lie not at an individual level, but at the level of rural society and even beyond or above it. In other words, macro level explains micro level. The book provokes some broader issues than rural India, and I will focus on that because I'm not in a position to seriously discuss what's happening in rural India because I do not have any clue, actually. And I would like to discuss two of those broader issues. First, how society manages suicides. And I also keep in mind human behavior at large at the background, not just suicides. However, that would be too much for this discussion. The second issue is the importance of non-economic forces in economic transformations. The first issue of suicides inevitably refers, at least in my mind, to Emile Durkheim and his famous classical sociological study of suicides. And when you said that suicides are mostly economic or psychological, for me it is obvious it is sociological because of that classical sociological study. And here I want to underline a paradox, if you like. From the one hand, the book is opposite, absolutely opposite to Durkheim in its approach. So, I mean, qualitative versus quantitative. And a lot of references to psychology in your book. And that word, I mean, psychology, psychological, was almost a dirty word for Durkheim. From the other hand, conclusions in the book are somewhat Durkheimian for me. They are absolutely sociological, where structure prevails and even dominates action. This is my view, how I understand this book. The second point here refers to those three types of suicide suggested by Durkheim: egoistic, altruistic, and anomic. Ironically, it is hard to choose any of them in your case, because we can find arguments for all of them. The most obvious reference is to anomic suicide, because we see dramatic changes in rural India, which cause not only increased the rate of suicide, but also provoked widely discussed in India rural protests. Egoistic suicide refers to diminishing solidarity in rural communities, which therefore are no longer a shield from committing suicide. Altruistic type refers to a situation of an, I would say, new normality of farmer suicides. For me, one of the most striking citations from an interviews you conducted in the book is the one where farmers make jokes about the possibility of committing suicide. So for me, when people make jokes on something, it means that they accept it as normal. So farmers just follow the norm, considering suicide as a pretty viable option, which, as I said, refers to the altruistic type. To my mind, the reason why we can apply all three types all three types of Durkheimian suicides to your case, the reason of that is that society works maybe in a slightly more complicated manner than Durkheim suggested. It should be a more tricky process than Durkheim thought. For instance, some parts of the decision-making to commit suicide can be driven by various and different reasons. There could be many layers, not just one. In this case, for instance, Robert Merton's distinction between accepting or rejecting social goals and means of their achievement could be useful. For instance, a person can accept his masculine status and all corresponding demands to it, but at the same time he can reject institutional means of its maintenance. So in one part it is altruistic, in the other anomic. The second issue, which I really appreciate in your book, is its focus on social ties and solidarity. In other words, those are non-economic parts of human life. Economy, of course, is important, and you pay a lot of attention to it in your book, but it is not the cornerstone of it. And I really like it because today people are obsessed with economy, see it as an ultimate explanation to everything and an ultimate remedy to any problem. Obviously, for a sociologist, economy is just a part of society, but the book underlines the importance of really non-economic activities which do not deal with earning for living, like marriage and family and communities. So it once more drives our attention to a simple and obvious fact that economy alone cannot make a person happy. Such things like respect, appreciation, sympathy, and so on are no less fundamental than food and a roof overhead. And neglecting those can lead to serious troubles, and the book demonstrates that quite well. So I finished.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And now,
I'm glad that this interesting, beautiful book now is presented here. I don't agree with colleague Alexander Kurakin that it's a theological book. I suppose this book contains different interdisciplinary approaches, and it's very well balanced combination between sociology, psychology, political science, cultural sciences. I think also that Russia doesn't have this example, special monography about suicide in Russian countryside. And I think not all countries have this specific monographs about the problem suicide in rural areas, in countryside. And of course, India is a great peasant country now, and I don't know which country has more peasants, India or China? Maybe India now is, yes, so India is champion among all peasant countries at all. And of course, you describe the process of great transformation of Indian peasantry in the processes of Green Revolution, in the processes of new industrialization and new technologies. Peterim Sorokin, about 100 years ago, formulated this paradox that the growth of progress is the road for the growth of suicide. And for example, Russia 100 years ago has a very low rate of suicide in comparison with European countries. And by the way, in Russia 100 years ago, the rate of suicide in countryside was less than in Russian urban areas. Now, in contemporary Russia, we know that in a whole, Russia has very high rate of suicide in the world. Russia is one of the leaders in these processes. And I think that the rate of suicide in Russian countryside is higher than in India countryside. And also, approximately, the rate of suicide in Russian countryside twice more than in Russian urban areas. But I don't think that we have some clear connections between progress, between rural politics and the rate of suicide. I give you an example. For example, we can suppose that the welfare state provides their citizens very comfortable conditions for their private life, for example, but we can find also the higher rate of suicide among not only Indian farmers or among rural dwellers in Russia, but also in among Swedish farmers and farmers of Finland. But we know that this countryside, one of the more comfortable with wonderful welfare state conditions and so on. So the problem of suicide is very complicated. It's strange, mysterious problem. Не мистическое, но таинственное. How to say таинственное in English? Mystical. Mystical problem. So I give you an example. In the period of the growth of welfare state in Soviet Union in 1916, in 1917, in 1980s, it was one of the highest level of suicide in Russian countryside. Of course, the main problem was famous alcoholism in period of Brezhnev ruling. And we know two peak of suicide in Russian countryside. It's period of late Brezhnev state. It's the beginning of 1980s. In period perestroika, it was period of decline because of the struggle against alcoholism, and also high peak of suicide was in 1990s, especially in the end of 1990s. And now the picture is relatively stable. I mean, it's less than it was in the end of 1990s years. So I should stress that suicide is a very strange phenomenon. Again, I try to compare conditions for suicide, phenomenon of suicide in contemporary Russia and contemporary India, reading your book. And I thought also about some polarization of conditions for suicide. It's strange was for me that you didn't use at all the term agrarian overpopulation. It's strange because agrarian overpopulation is very dangerous phenomenon, and for example, in some cases, is the origins of famous peasant revolutions, like it was in again in Russia 100 years ago, as it was in China, in Mexico, and so on and so on. But we know also another road for this problem, this phenomenon of agrarian overpopulation. This phenomenon was described by famous American anthropologist Clifford Geertz. He researched Indonesia, and he stressed that sometimes the overpopulation is origin for so-called involution. Involution is a strange phenomenon when local communities doesn't have opportunity to develop, and they prefer to develop inside their own culture, their own economies in conditions of overpopulation. And also in the situation of involution, we can see the growth of suicide among rural population. So my first question is, what do you think about the pressure of agrarian overpopulation for Indian farmers, and maybe it's also origins for the growth of suicide? In Russian case, we can absolutely opposite situation. The main problem for Russian countryside, including maybe North Caucasus, it's alienation and depopulation in countryside. And the second question, yes, what do you think about the phenomenon involution in some regions of India? Of course, we can see that I think many rural regions of India has opportunity for development, but maybe same time some economic, political factors blocked this opportunity to develop. And in this case, we can analyze this phenomenon, connections between involution of countryside and the problem of suicide. Again, thank you very much for your wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And would you like to respond to discussants right now, or prefer to collect all comments?
Maybe we can have all the questions, and then I can respond in the end.
Okay, yeah, go. Okay, now the floor is open. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions because as I have understood, your studies basically is based on qualitative interviewing with people, but I think that suicide is the topic which can be statistically investigated or researched, because normally we have quite a lot of statistics, and this statistics is quite detailed. For example, we can compare rural and urban areas, men and women, age categories, and so on and so forth. And so my questions are about this statistical picture, because I'm sure that you have looked at it, and maybe you can clarify, and maybe it can be used in order to test the conclusions which you made on the basis of qualitative interviewing. For example, to what extent, I mean, if we compare Indian suicide rates with other countries, is it higher, lower? So where and if we within India, where suicide is high in urban population or rural population, then what about regional differences? Maybe if there are, if the suicide rate is homogeneous, I mean, all regions have more or less the same suicide rate in rural areas. So in this case, it can be country factors or something like that. But if you have regional differences, so you may look at and connect the suicide to the conditions of those regions, and then you can test some of your hypotheses. Or, for example, in which age you have higher rate of suicide among farmers. Are they younger or are they older? Because in this case, the hypothesis that there is a sense of nostalgia, then I can't imagine that young people can kill themselves because of nostalgia, because they cannot go to the period of time to live in that old times. So that statistical picture, if you can somehow give the picture of that, maybe interesting figures. And then the question is about, another question is about over-indebtedness, because here we have probably an example of the effect of microfinance organizations, because in rural India, the banks cannot operate, or they are less numerous or less often, because microfinance and Muhammad Yunus and the Nobel Prize for that. And also the idea is that if people are over-indebted, then because the whole idea of microfinance loans is that people are not given loans individually; they are given loans to the collectives, I mean to the village as a whole, and then they are responsible for that collectively, because if they don't pay back, then new credit is not going to be given. And so in this case, how that can be contribute to this picture, because you spoke about the change in like Indian villages are changing, so probably from collective to more individualistic culture. And so, but microfinance is based mostly on collective rather than individualistic. And then if they are over-indebted in this sense, of how can how can be embedded into the argument that it is because of individualistic shift. So that's, and also a comment, I can't imagine that if you are over-indebted, so you can solve this problem by killing yourself, because debt is inherited. And so if you are a father of a family and you are over-indebted, if you kill yourself, your relatives have to pay the debt. So it is not a solution. It's probably even aggravation of the problem. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Any other interventions? Yes. Leonid, yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sutara, for your thoughtful and very interesting interdisciplinary outlook on the problem of suicide. I was amazed looking at the scholarship on suicide in the rural area, that it's relatively big realm of research and an international phenomenon.
Turn off your video.
In the country. Can you hear me? Everything is okay?
Now, yeah, again, but we could not hear you for half a minute before.
Oh, sorry about that. Probably it's an issue with the internet on my side. So I found that it seems, if you look at the literature, that it's a pretty big issue in India. More important than in many other countries. Also, we can find some literature about well-developed countries as well. However, it seems that for India, it's especially big issue. And it seems that your study, it's highlighted some major problems there. And it seems that you analyze it as interdisciplinary issue, but the title of your book sounds, I would say, hopelessly. It seems that it is a sort of dilapidation of the rural, and the major causes are economic. I look at the table in the book, and I found it definitely at the page in the beginning of 12, and it seems that economic factors are definitely dominated ones. So it seems that it's a sort of destruction, as you mentioned, but it's not creative destruction. You mentioned Schumpeter in your study, but does it mean that actually it's only destruction without creation? so it's do you agree totally pessimistic view on the process that it is a sort of destruction of the rural area without the process of creation something new? You mentioned the new friends, but it isn't clear. Is it friends that potentially could help the farmers to overcome the crisis and to reach the track of prosperity and finally the decline of so high rate of suicide, especially for males, because it seems that it's a very, very big gap between males and females, more than in 10 times if we compare these gender groups. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Colleagues, any other comments, interventions? Anything? I cannot see anyone, but let me say a few words. Then I have already mentioned that I read this book 2 days ago, and I must say it was a fascinating reading. I must admit that I'm not an expert in rural affairs, but anyway, and by the way, yes, I perceived it as essentially sociological. I mean, not in terms of strict discipline, but I mean in terms of some kind of substantive understanding of issues. And the book actually started from a real puzzle. We always trying to start with some puzzles, and here it's obviously a puzzle. I mean, those high rates of suicides among male farmers, and particularly in more prosperous areas in terms of agricultural productivity, and not in poorest areas, which make it more puzzling. And what is important, actually, yes, that explanations are not confined to psychological factors, psychological stresses, and of course we know from the times of Emil Durkheim that this phenomenon is largely social, or it may be psychological, but with having sociological facts behind it, obviously. And yes, it's also important that the author suggested a holistic approach, including economic, psychological, and social, and political, and of course political, being the political science. At the same time, the political is here is defined rather in broad sense, by no means confined to electoral behavior or protest movements, but rather, yes, as you mentioned, that as collective behavior, collective activity. And yes, the book presents a rather comprehensive picture of change, starting with changes in self-identity and changes of meaning of self among these farmers, which is in turn linked with the understanding of community and changes in community, and also some changes and erosion of traditional masculine values, and inability to maintain and to raise your social status and prestige in community, and inability to maintain a role of breadwinner in front of your family, and also many changes in the environment, and particularly you pay a lot of attention to these changes, to the changes in notion of public spaces called chopals, yeah, and chopals, it's traditional public gatherings under the banyan trees. Yeah, well, at least in former times. Now, I guess they arrange it in the buildings.
Because trees are not there.
Because yes, due to Green Revolution, trees are not there anymore. And yes, and these traditional public spaces were largely corrupt by numerous factors, including intervention of commercial companies with their attractive merchandise and political parties, which try to exploit these communities, persuaded to serve their interests, and state intervention, of course. So in the end, we have a gradual transformation or dilapidation of this traditional society and rural community. And when reading this book, I was thinking about Russia. I did not know much about the rates of suicide in the countryside. Alexander told me that the rates are quite high, but what I knew actually, always know, that we had very high rates of alcohol-related mortality, particularly among men. So, and I guess this high rate of suicide in countryside also largely due to they are also alcohol-related. And of course, there is a lot of differences between India and Russia. And yes, we have large rural areas which are depopulated, particularly in the west or in the north. And when actually younger people were moving to the urban areas, and the older people eventually died. But still, there is a lot of commonalities here. I believe that we witnessed very many similar things. I mean, dilapidation of the rural society in Russia as well. And by the way, regarding, I remember that these drug and alcohol issues are also relevant to India, or at least they've been spreading, not so much as in Russia, I guess. We are different, but still it's also a problem. So all in all, thank you so much. It's a fascinating book, and for me it was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
And now let me ask once again if any other questions and comments. If not, then now it's the floor back to you for your concluding remarks.
Thank you, friends. Thank you very much for your comments and questions, especially the two discussants who actually, I would say, in many respects explained it better than me, perhaps. And I'm really glad, as an author, I think one feels good if you are able to communicate some aspect of it to the reader. So thank you to both the commentators and other questions. Now, Alex, I mean, I don't know how to respond because the Himes categories I was trying to deal with, but I was not specifically using that as a theoretical framework to explain it. So when you say that it tries to bring in all three aspects together, I would say that perhaps yes, and I would be glad to accept that if I'm able to contribute some bit to that literature. With regard to the methodology and the nature of the book, whether it is sociological or economic, or whether it deals with economics and so on, I found it really challenging, and I thought of not really getting into that debate. And I tried to highlight the way the respondents talked about the issue. So basically the book tries to put forward the way the respondents looked at that problem. And it is, I think when we talk about responses, at times it is difficult to put them into, given frameworks, whether these responses are sociological, economic, and political. And I think that's where interdisciplinary nature of studies are far more helpful. I would look at it like this. And suicide is one issue, I think, where all these concerns, they merge together. So perhaps we need to look at it further to explain the problem in a more nuanced way. That's how I look at it. Professor Nikulin, thank you. I didn't know much about Russia. I haven't really been able to follow it up. But I would like to link the point which you mentioned about alcoholism being the major factor, and which you also mentioned in the end, Professor Radaev, that how alcoholism is a major problem. Now, when in the book I'm talking about rural distress, I'm also mentioning that rural distress is something which involves suicides, but also other indicators of distress, which includes alcoholism, drug addiction, and other collective forms of violence. So I think alcoholism is actually not a reason for suicide. Alcoholism is actually a manifestation of the distress which prevails. So it is one way of looking at a problem and saying that, okay, this is actually a cause. I think it's not a cause, it's a symptom. The symptom is something else. And perhaps it would be interesting to look at the Russian case from that perspective, by looking at alcoholism as one of the indicators of increasing distress in the rural areas, and then look at it. It may not always culminate into suicides. Many a times it does. So suicide and alcoholism, they need to be segregated and then understood, instead of looking at alcoholism leading to suicide. That's how I would like to put it forward. Maybe we can have further discussion on this issue. Regarding the point which you mentioned, agrarian overpopulation. In fact, in case of India, the surprising thing is that agrarian overpopulation, though I'm a bit uncomfortable using that word, but if we use that conceptual term, it was actually a major phenomena till 1980s. After that, agrarian overpopulation starts decreasing in India. And yet, the problem of suicide actually becomes far more serious when the role of agriculture starts declining in its economy and in its society as well. So in case of India, at least, I don't think actually it's a very useful explanation which we find. In fact, it's the opposite which is true. Maybe it could be true in other societies. I need to look at it further. But such a term in India, in fact, that is used time and again by various policymakers to, change the focus from rural development to urban development. And the logic given is that since India has a lot of small farms, so what is desirable is to make people move from agriculture to non-agriculture sector. That diversification has started happening, and it is happening. But the way it is conceptualized, I think there is a problem. And the point which the colleague mentioned just now about the title of the book, and the way it tries to explain that there is something which is getting destroyed without actually giving something in return in the form of a constructive creation. I think this is what actually it is. So there is a focus of shifting people, taking people out from agriculture and rural areas, but leading to where is something which has not really been reflected in policy thinking. And that actually leaves a lot of aspirational groups, people, youth in a lurch without having any vision of the future. And that creates, the distress situations. The about your comments on quantitative. Yes, in the book I do discuss a few issues related to profiling and providing some kind of explanations of the data. But I must highlight that it is true that suicide is understood quantitatively. But in the book, in the first chapter in methodology, I do discuss that there were some colleagues who had actually highlighted that a quantitative analysis may not be able to capture the, if we call it a puzzle or a mystical situation like suicide. So that's where, I decided to have a mixed approach, focus more on narratives, interviews, and a qualitative approach rather than going only by data. And I must say that it was an emotional, ethical dilemma also, that when you are going to a grieving family and then you go and ask them for profile and then start filling the questionnaire, I found it actually unethical. Many of our colleagues had done it before, and they said that actually we found that it has serious limitations. Because, and I'll give you an example, that one hypothesis with which most of the people went there to the families, thinking that it's a problem related to indebtedness. And as we all know, I think, in small farmer agrarian families, indebtedness is not something unique. It's actually a very common phenomenon. But indebtedness leading to suicide is something which is very uncommon, especially in India, for example, and there are scholars who talk about it, that in rural areas, suicide was not such a big problem. Despite indebtedness being there, despite rural poverty being there, despite low production rate being there, what changes? That is the question. And the book tries to actually capture that process of change in the words of people, the way they explain it. So the profiling related issues are there in the form of different tables. And just to 2 points, for example, one is about the gender. Majority of farmers, not even majority, in fact, I would say more than 90% farmer suicides are actually the suicides of male. And the large age group in which they figure is the intermediary age group, starting from 40 to 50, 40 to 55. So that is, in fact, I would say even that was a strange, that age 40 to 55 age group feeling nostalgic about it. But it also reflects the faster pace of change that is happening, that even that generation is getting hang of, that there is something which is changing very rapidly and which we find it difficult to handle. And the narrative which Alex had mentioned about young boys joking about it, they are actually young, in their 30s, who say that we have no other option but to kill ourselves. So gradually, it is percolating down to the youth who are also feeling equally restless. And I think I would also accept that perhaps it would be desirable to come up with more quantifiable categories, questions, so that these problems can be compared across different states, and we can have more informative hypothesis which can be used by other scholars. And that is one limitation which I think I have. So maybe in future research I would try to overcome that limitation. Another point was related to the microfinance. In India, in fact, I would say for microfinance, one thing which is required is to have a sense of collective to whom you can give loans. The problem is that in a society where collectives are collapsing, which are those collectives whom you finance? Now, in the recent past, Government of India has come up with a major scheme called Farmer Producer Organizations, FPOs, and they are trying to revitalize cooperatives, which can be actually further strengthened. But I think both these concepts require very active political constructive intervention, which I think is not happening, because there is a major role of market forces which is now coming into this agriculture sector, and it also comes along with the gradual state withdrawal. For collective formation, I think role of state is very critical. So I believe that is one question which relates me to my previous work about the nature of state. So in this process, I think it is necessary for the state to play a role of a constructive actor, proactively, sending a message or giving a sense that it exists and it cares. When the state stops giving that message to people, I think the psychological distress worsens further. So yeah, I mean, thank you for your comments, and I think it would be interesting to have some kind of comparative understanding of India and Russia, if I may say so. And I look forward to discussing this issue further in a more nuanced manner. I hope I tried to address some of the questions, if not all. And thank you very much again for patient hearing, and thank you for taking time off and reading this book. I'm really honored, I'm delighted, and I look forward to working with all of you in future. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Suthar, for this discussion, and also let me thank our discussants and all you guys taking part in this discussion as well. So, and for you, good luck, and let us believe that some comparative studies will also take place, between India and Russia. Thank you all. See you next Tuesday.